that simple fact is concealed from the individual banker because it doesn't happen here inside the bank. It happens as a result of the transactions between banks.
As the men who ran the Federal Reserve knew very well, it happens when money loaned by one bank is deposited in another bank to be loaned out yet again. In the Depression, the process was working in reverse. The banks were destroying money. Nonetheless, the Federal Reserve let it happen.
The end result was that by the time the whole sorry episode was over, by 1933, the quantity of money in the United States had gone down by a third. The slow throttling had turned into strangulation. For every $3 of currency and deposits that people had had in 1929, only $2 were left. For every 3 banks that were open in 1929, in 1933, only 2 were left.
The terrible depression that followed was a direct result of bungling by the Federal Reserve System. Their monetary policy stifled any hope of economic recovery. Worse still, America's depression was to become worldwide because of what lies behind these doors. This is the vault of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Inside is the largest hoard of gold in the world. Because the world was on a gold standard in 1929, these vaults where the U.S. gold was stored provide an excellent test of where the Depression originated. If the Depression had started in Europe or somewhere else in the world, the U.S. would have lost gold. More gold would have flown out of the country than came in. If, on the other hand, the Depression started in the United States, well, then the opposite would happen. More gold would come in from abroad as the effects of our depression spread there, then went out abroad. In reality, that is exactly what happened. When the international money system was based on gold, the rules of the game were these. The gold in the United States was supposed to control the amount of money issued by the Federal Reserve. In turn, the amount the Federal Reserve issued controlled the amount of money issued by the commercial banks, which in turn controlled the amount of money that individuals, businesses, and industry could get from the banks. The result, a monetary structure, all supposedly tied to the amount of gold in the vaults in the United States. But in 1930, the Federal Reserve didn't play by the rules. It stood by as banks started to collapse, and with each one that went, the money supply fell. Businesses and industry inevitably began to fail. Americans, now poorer, bought less from abroad. Britain was one of the countries affected. Like the United States, Britain had its own monetary structure tied to gold. The trouble was that Britain could now sell less abroad. It cut down the amount it bought from abroad, but not by enough. Under the rules of the gold standard, it had to pay the difference in gold. With every bar of gold that was shipped out of Britain, the amount of money decreased. A depression that was already underway in Britain got worse. British gold flowed into the United States, supposedly to form the foundation of a new slice of the monetary structure. But the Federal Reserve didn't let it. The gold was simply locked away. The results? Britain remained in trouble until in 1931 it went off the gold standard, cutting the link between the amount of gold and the amount of money. In the United States, suffering the worst depression in history, there was plenty of gold, but to no avail.
Although these events happened almost 50 years ago, many of our policies today derive directly from them. Central bankers throughout the world, government officials everywhere, are afraid of a new Great Depression. They have therefore moved in the opposite direction. Instead of the problem of too little money, we are faced with the problem of too much money. The problems of inflation that plague us today trace directly from the problem of deflation that plagued us from 1929 to 1933.
People came to believe that free market capitalism had failed. Something was needed to replace it. At Cambridge University in England, a new orthodoxy emerged in the 30s, one that has remained powerful to this day. It owes its influence to the brilliance of one man.
John Maynard Keynes was unquestionably one of the greatest economists of all time. Like other economists of his generation, he found the Great Depression both a paradox and a challenge. It was a paradox because it seemed to contradict some of the fundamental principles that economists had come to take for granted. Keynes rose to the challenge by constructing a complex and sophisticated hypothesis which not only explained what had been going on, but also offered a way out, a way to end the Great Depression and to avoid similar episodes in the future. The core of his theory was that what happens if the quantity of money didn't matter. What really mattered was a particular category of spending, in economists' jargon, autonomous spending. What kind of spending is that? It might be investment by business enterprises in building factories, adding to the number of machines, and adding to inventories. It might be spending by individuals to build houses. Or, most important of all, it might be deficit spending by government. If private spending on investment, on house building, was not enough to maintain full employment, then government could always step in and spend enough to make up the difference. The theory of pump priming was born. The theory was a godsend to politicians who had been grasping at any expedient. After all, throughout the ages, politicians have been only too willing to spend money, provided they didn't have to tax their citizens to pay for it. And here along came a scientific theory offered under the most responsible of auspices that justified what they had been wanting to do all along. Is it any wonder that government spending has exploded ever since, or that deficit spending, even without the excuse of war, and on a large scale, has become the order of the day?
In America, the new Roosevelt administration adopted the Keynesian approach. It authorized massive spending on government projects. It involved government increasingly in the running of the economy. It developed programs designed to provide security for every individual.
Okay, so that's our first step. Yes. So questions on the video or comments?
How did you get involved in the Federal Reserve?
How did
you get involved?
Well, when you're as famous as he is, they are willing to do that. Now, you didn't go on the Federal Reserve tour with us, did you? Or did you?
No, I was
We were in the vault. So if they let little old us, Russ McCullough and his students, who went that day? Adam, you did? John? Anybody else? Yeah, we went to the Federal Reserve, and so you can get pictures of all the money and stuff like that. So it's not that unusual. It would be unusual to get to sit on the gold, obviously, but they were probably a little more lax back in those days compared to now with all of our terrorism threats. Boy, this thing's bringing up more dirt as I'm erasing it, isn't it? Okay. So, as countries run deficits, there's a flow of gold between the countries. Why gold? What's the big deal with gold, having our dollars backed by gold? And by the way, do we have that standard now? No. So our money is backed by nothing right now. It is just floating out there. But why gold? What was it about gold?
It's well considered the most, well, a widely accepted form of valuable payment throughout all the world.
Okay, so yeah, I would say there's some sort of longevity with payment and stuff and some value. One thing is that it's pretty fixed. The world supply of gold is pretty stable. You know, we've got people out mining gold right now, but they don't find very much relative to the whole supply of gold. And so the main reason why gold was chosen, desirability was one thing historically, but probably even more important was that the world supply of gold was pretty fixed. And so if the supply of gold is fixed, what's true about the supply of money?
Should be fixed.
It's also fixed. So this was a way to, when it was originally designed, it was meant to kind of guarantee some austerity on the part of governments and how much money they print. So why gold? Because it is basically fixed in supply and therefore would make money. Therefore would make money basically fixed in supply. Government can't run the printing press. Government cannot run the printing press. It just can't create money to pay for its bills. All right, so this takes away, there is basically no discretionary monetary policy. There is no such thing, basically. There's no discretionary monetary policy. All right, so any questions so far? Yes?
So would your value basically be fixed then, like $1 worth of a certain amount of gold, period?
Yes, there was a convertibility of gold. So you've seen the, well, like the silver certificates they had for a while, but basically you could go redeem at any given point in time. What the rule was, the rule of law, was that you could go redeem your currency for an equivalent amount of gold. And that relationship was fixed. So you could always go to the government and say, hey, I want my gold. Okay, here you go. Here's $100, you give me the equivalent amount of gold. And so it was redeemable and fixed to it, yes. Okay, anything else?
So by doing that, you can decrease the money supply. Or would they would keep it in the system?
That's right, because there wouldn't be as much gold. And then they later limited the convertibility. And part of, I don't want to take away too much thunder from this next system. So this next video we're going to watch talks about the Bretton Woods Agreement. So what Milton just described was what kind of the U.S. system was up until the Great Depression. And then at the time of the Great Depression, when Britain fell to pieces and left the gold standard, then we went to this different system called Bretton Woods, and it's also discussed in the textbook as well.
What year that video was made? One that we just watched.
That one, 1980. Yeah, that was the free to choose videos, or it was a subset of the. I'm pretty sure that was a subset of the free to choose videos. And I can send you the link Let's see, where's my other one here? Crash course. I believe this guy is just a professor somewhere that put this together.
Twins. I didn't see them coming. I have obligations. Huge obligations. Obligations. I need to rethink the core of my portfolio. What I really need is sleep.
Introducing the iSharing score, building blocks for the heart of your portfolio.
Before we move on to current events, it's vital to know how we got here. I will now present an extremely shortened version of recent U.S. monetary history. The purpose of this section is to show you that the U.S. government has radically shifted the rules during times of emergency, and that our monetary system is really a lot younger than you might think. After the panic of 1907, when private banker J.P. Morgan intervened as the lender of last resort, banks began agitating for a government solution. What was finally decided upon in 1913 was a federally sponsored cartel called the Federal Reserve, which sounded governmental, but really was not. The stock of the Federal Reserve was to be held by its member banks, not the U.S. government, nor the public, which remains the case today. So what we call the Federal Reserve actually is a federally sponsored banking cartel, licensed to lend money into existence. By the 1930s, a federally reserve-fueled speculative bubble had burst, resulting in numerous bank failures, which shrank the money supply by nearly a third in 3 years. Despite being chartered as a lender of last resort, the Federal Reserve failed to halt a catastrophic banking collapse. In 1933, newly elected President Franklin D. Roosevelt decided to counter the falling money supply in a most drastic manner. To accomplish this, he confiscated all privately held gold and immediately devalued the U.S. dollar. Prior to the seizure, it took approximately $21 to buy an ounce of gold, and afterwards, it took $35. Soon after, contractual obligations of the U.S. government, such as bonds payable in gold, were nullified with the approval of the Supreme Court. This goes to show how governments in a period of emergency can change rules and break their own laws. All of the seized gold either ended up in the vaults of the Federal Reserve or at the International Monetary Fund or on the books of the Federal Reserve. A grand total of $11 billion was exchanged for all 261 million ounces of the nation's gold. In other words, complete control of the gold supply of the most powerful and prosperous nation on earth was exchanged for $11 billion printed out of thin air, creating some very serious storage hardships for the Federal Reserve. I mean, have you ever tried lifting 70-pound gold bricks that high over your head? In any event, to end the turmoil of depression and war, and to provide a foundation for global recovery, a conference was held at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944, with all the major Allied powers attending. Recognizing that the U.S. then represented nearly half of the global economy, the U.S. dollar was made the global reserve currency. All other currencies had fixed rates of exchange to the dollar, which in turn was redeemable for gold at $35 per ounce. The Bretton Woods II system ushered in a period of prosperity and rapid economic recovery. But there was a flaw in the system. Nothing in the Bretton Woods Agreement prevented the U.S. Federal Reserve from expanding the supply of Federal Reserve notes. As this happened, the gold backing behind each dollar steadily declined, such that there was not enough gold to back all of the dollars. Meanwhile, as the Vietnam War intensified, the U.S. was running budget deficits and flooding the world with paper dollars. The French, under President Charles de Gaulle, became suspicious that the U.S. would be unable to honor its Bretton Woods obligations to redeem their excess dollars into gold. As the French exchanged their surplus dollars for gold, the U.S. Treasury's gold stocks declined alarmingly. Finally, President Nixon declared force majeure on August 15, 1971, and slammed the gold window, ending its dollar convertibility. That's what governments do during wartime, and the U.S. followed the pattern perfectly. But this time, it affected the whole world because the removal of gold convertibility of the dollar destroyed the foundation of the Bretton Woods system. Without a gold backing, there was no hard physical limit to how many paper dollars could be issued. Since we now know that all dollars are backed by debt, what do you suppose happened to U.S. debt levels once the externally applied rigor of gold was removed? Let's find out. This is a chart of U.S. federal debt from the period of 1949 to 2004. Note that it looks like any other exponential chart we've already reviewed, but especially note that the graph turns the corner shortly after Nixon slammed the gold window. That is, when Nixon removed the last vestige of external physical restraint from the system. And also note how rapidly the debt levels have climbed recently. These past few years have seen the highest and most rapid accumulation of federal debt in our entire history, thanks in large measure to an experiment never before attempted in our country's history, the conduct of 2 foreign wars and a tax cut at the same time. This rapid accumulation of debt is not a mysterious process at all. Rather, it's an entirely predictable consequence of the slamming of the gold window. How much longer can this continue? Unfortunately, there's no good answer to this besides, as long as foreigners let us. A second predictable and related consequence concerns the total amount of money in circulation. Remember, all money is loaned into existence, so the shape of the federal debt chart should tip you off to the shape of this next chart of U.S. money from the years 1959 to 2007. The first thing we can note here is that it took our country over 300 years, from the very first pilgrim until 1973, to generate our first $1 trillion of money stock. Every road, every bridge, every marketplace on every corner of every town, every boat, and every building, from the first colony until 1973, required $1 trillion of money stock. Our most recent $1 trillion, that was created in the last 4.5 months. My questions to you are these. What will it be like to live here when our nation is creating $1 trillion every 4 weeks? How about every 4 days? What about every 4 hours? 4 minutes? Where does this stop if not in hyperinflation and the destruction of the dollar, and by extension, our nation? If we view these events on a timeline, we can see that the Federal Reserve was formed in 1913, and that only 20 years later, in 1933, our country had entered a form of bankruptcy and had turned over its collected gold supply under force of law to the Federal Reserve. 11 years after that, the US dollar was enshrined as the world's reserve currency with an explicit backing by gold. That was unilaterally removed by Nixon 27 years later. In effect, the current global monetary system of unbacked currencies is now only 37 years old. It was not planned, but simply emerged out of a crisis. The unredeemable US dollar remains a popular reserve currency as a matter of convenience, but nothing requires or guarantees that it will retain this role. Only the US is able to use its eroding reserve currency status to borrow and print dollars to pay for its trade deficits. However, as the dollar loses its reserve currency status from this abuse, the US will be forced to either export more to pay for its imports, or to take on ever heavier levels of debt. If these actions cause the dollar to keep falling, other countries will be tempted to devalue their currencies to keep pace and remain competitive. The potential for an inflationary period is evident, which brings us to the next section.
Okay. Questions or comments on that? So, what we're left with is the world's currencies all just floating around, right? And some countries can choose to do a fixed rate policy still. So, a fixed exchange rate policy has different meaning now than maybe what it did before. Back in the Bretton Woods time, we were all under a fixed exchange rate policy, except for the US dollar. And that's what kind of caused problems. That's what caused it ultimately to collapse, is that we were able to eke out a few more dollars and dilute its value. So for a country, what they can do is intervene in the market to keep the exchange rate fixed. So a government intervenes in the foreign exchange market to keep its currency fixed to another's. All right, so let's come back to this picture. Suppose that the United States has an increase in the demand for imports from China. Okay? How does that impact the foreign exchange market if we want more plastic stuff from China? We demand Chinese goods. So there's an increase in demand for imports.
Increases the demand for
The yuan.
will also increase the supply.
Okay, so as we start to increase the demand for the yuan, right, because we need yuan in order to buy our Chinese stuff. So we go into the market, we being Americans here, and what are we doing with our dollars? We're exchanging them for yuan. And is that putting upward pressure or downward pressure on the yuan? Upward pressure. So that's this picture right here. So there's appreciation of the yuan. Now, if the Chinese government has a fixed exchange rate regime, and their goal is to keep the exchange rate fixed right here, what must it do to maintain the exchange rate?
Print or sell yuan.
All right, print or sell yuan. So it can increase yuan and meet that supply. So if it intervenes, now this is not the free market, right? This is the government coming in and saying, oh wow, there's upward pressure here. I'm not going to let that go up. I'm just going to start feeding the market yuans. Now by feeding the market yuans, what is it buying? Dollars. What does it do with them?
Buys imports, stuff imports.
Well, right now it's reserve currency.
Can it put it back on the market, right? So if they start buying up dollars, can they use those dollars to go buy American goods and maintain this? No. Because if they go back into the market and put those dollars back in, then the dollars are out there floating around again. So they're kind of undoing it. So China is holding a large volume of dollars. They are buying up, they're one of the biggest owners of dollars because of the way they manage their currency. And so over the last 20 years, they've been hoarding and hoarding dollars, keeping the yuan cheap, so that us Americans are like, oh yeah, we love those Chinese goods, you know, they're always cheap. Well, they wouldn't be cheap if they wouldn't have intervened in the market, because the value of their currency would have gone up, making it more expensive for us to do it. Okay, so that's a little insight into that. Now, on the flip side, if the demand for Chinese goods falls, then they would have to do what with their hoard of dollars? Yeah, they would have to take their holding, let's just say they have a treasure trove of $100 bills, right? They're holding back currency. That is their reserve currency, or part of their currency that the government's holding. Now they're going to have to start getting rid of dollars and buying up yuan, doing the exact opposite of what we just said, right? So they're going to take yuan off the market, because now when there's a decrease in demand, they need to pull the supply back of yuan. Can they do that forever? No. So that's the one part. They can do this forever because they can run the printing press. They can head this direction, but they can't hold this direction. And so if countries start to run out of the foreign currency, what's their only choice?
Why? Allow interest rates to rise.
Allow the exchange rate
Right.
to adjust, right? Yeah, not interest rates, but the exchange rate. So just think of it this way. If they start to correct for this to try to get back up to here, but they run short right here, they're tapped out of dollars, they can't do anything except devalue the currency. And so this is called a devaluation, not a depreciation, but a devaluation, because they have chosen to follow a fixed exchange rate, and now they were forced to devalue their exchange rate. And they might have to dig down deeper if they think that it's going to keep going lower. And so in some cases, countries are forced to do a devaluation. They can also go in the upward direction too if they need to. Revaluation, or increase in value. So that is the difference between fixed exchange rate and flexible exchange rate. It's just if the government is in the market to try to modify. I'll write a little bit of that down, but does anybody have any questions before I do what we just did there? Okay, so government intervenes in the foreign exchange market to keep its currency fixed to another's. It will buy/sell units of foreign currency to maintain the fixed nominal exchange rate, RN. Note, it can always supply more of its own currency by printing money. But cannot use foreign reserves, foreign currency, that it does not have. So this may force devaluation. Okay, so devaluation is a reduction in the value of a currency that is chosen by the government. In other words, a government that's under a fixed exchange rate regime. Note, depreciation is and market forces causing a decrease in value. And that's just kind of a terminology thing. All right, the last little thing that I just want to sneak in that this kind of goes with exactly what we just did is called a crawling peg. Currencies can be pegged to another currency. It's not fixed. So a version of a fixed exchange rate is called a crawling peg, also called a dirty float. Instead of a floating exchange rate, we have a dirty float. What's so dirty about it? We just periodically change the currency, like every 6 months or whatever. We kind of reevaluate. So we hold it fixed for a period of time and then we reevaluate and change it. So currency value is changed periodically. So it's just a version of a fixed exchange rate. All right, we'll call it a day there. Yeah, it wasn't last night. Okay, I haven't posted. I thought I had it maybe posted without the due date, but I'll get that.